And additionally, there are pre-submitted questions. So the students have looked at several documents about you, your faculty profile, your lab webpage, and I think an article about a wrongful conviction case that you were involved with as an expert consultant.
Yeah.
So they have questions about all those things pre-submitted, and they'll also be asking questions live. If you wouldn't mind, so folks should already know kind of your bio, but if you could give us just a real quick introduction of who you are, what you do at UF professionally as a researcher, professor.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Yep, happy to do so. So thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I am really passionate about undergraduates getting involved with research because I think it's one of the coolest things that you can do while you're at UF. I mean, obviously you all are in this class, so you feel strongly about it too. So I feel like we're kindred spirits. So I'm happy to share my experiences and talk about that kind of stuff with you all. So I am an associate professor. I'm in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law. My degree is a little strange, though. I'm not a criminologist and I'm not a sociologist. I'm a psychologist. Our criminology program is pretty unique because we are an interdisciplinary program. So historically, we've had anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists. We have a social ecologist, anthropologists, all sorts of different social science disciplines. But our common theme is that we all study issues with crime and law or the legal system. And so I am on the law and society side of that. So I look at what happens once crime is committed. And my work, I'm trained as a psychologist. I'm a social psychologist. A lot of times when people hear psychologist in crime, they think, oh, you study serial killers. And I don't. I know I'm not that cool. But I look more at what happens when the legal process starts. So in social psychology, the main kind of thrust of that is to look at how people behave in social situations. So how the context of where we are and what's happening around us influences how we behave. And I look at how people make decisions in the social context of the legal system. So my big overarching theme is really to look at how prosecutors decide whether to prosecute a case, or how a jury makes a decision, and how we can come up with rules or procedures to help them make the best decisions possible. The case that you all read about was an eyewitness case. And so one of the things that I do is I look at how the procedures around eyewitness identification can affect whether someone picks a suspect from a lineup. And because of course, when we're talking about eyewitness testimony, you want the only thing affecting whether they're picking someone to be whether the person matches their memory, right? But what we find in our research is that a lot of other things also can affect whether they're going to pick a suspect. And sometimes that can lead to cases of wrongful conviction, like in the case that you all read about. So that's kind of the goal of my research. People in my field, I went to graduate school in legal psychology down at Florida International University. So I got my PhD in legal psychology with a minor in social psychology. And people in my field generally will go on and become academics like myself. And in that sense, my goal as an academic is because I love teaching, I love interacting with students. That's super fun for me. And then the goal of my research is to create science-based policies and procedures to help us maximize just outcomes in the legal system and minimize mistakes. So a mistake happens, right, when we convict a person who's innocent or when we release a person who is guilty. And so my goal in research is to kind of strike the balance between those two outcomes and make sure we're trying to minimize mistakes on both ends. Other people who went to graduate school with me that went more into what we call the field, right? So they take their research degree, the PhD, and then they apply it to real world situations. And they're doing all sorts of things so that's one thing I think is interesting about research is that there's a lot of opportunity in corporations and in different different institutions to work in these applied settings, applying research skills. So we have a lot of people who work for government agencies. So like the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Center for State Courts, the Federal Judicial Center, like all of those institutions that use research and need good social scientists that can help them collect and interpret data. And then we also have people who work in trial consulting. And so trial consulting is essentially, it's a very broad field, but the people who come at it from my discipline generally are using the same types of social psychological methods that I use to do my research to answer questions in particular trials. So for example, they might say, the attorneys might approach them and say, okay, well, how can we best make these arguments so that people understand them? Or what kind of people should I put on my jury that are going to understand my client's case? And so they do that initial work and research. It's not, if you've seen the show Bull, the TV show Bull, it's about a trial consultant. It's not like that. So they're not like nefarious and like getting into people's like, you know, doing investigations and in their houses and things like that. But it's more coming from a broader psychological perspective, and then using our research skills to try to help the attorneys best try the case. And then other people went even broader. So even though their specialization in graduate school was in legal type skills, they went off into other fields, and you can apply those types of skills to other fields, other types of things. So one person I went to graduate school with now is one of the marketing experts at EA Games, the video game place, that's what it is. And then another one works for Mattel, and another one works for like an energy, like Cliff Bar type place. So there's all sorts of opportunities really to apply those research skills. So I think it's really important for undergraduates when they hear about getting involved with research and thinking about graduate degrees and things like that, to hear that there's more opportunities than like the one that's most accessible to us, obviously, is because you're learning from your professors. And so a lot of times academia seems like that's the path, but it's actually a lot broader than that for sure. So that's a little bit about me, but here we go.
Thanks so much for that very informative introduction. Would anyone like to get us started with a question? Or if you're feeling shy, I can start with one on the list. I'll go to the list and let you guys build up your confidence. Janelle Roy had a question about your most recent case that you worked on as an expert consultant that we read about. This was someone exonerated after 34 years. What was your biggest takeaway from that case? How did you get involved? And then a kind of a separate question she had is about undergraduate research. And for someone with no prior experience, if they were interested in something like the LEAD lab, what should they put on their applications, and how can they best demonstrate their strengths in a meaningful way?
Sure. So those are awesome questions. So I'll start with the case. So I have done some consulting once I got tenure. So I'm not sure how much you all have talked about tenure, but tenure essentially is you get a trial period for your first 7 years as a professor. And then at that point, you submit all the research and teaching and service and things that you've done, and they decide whether you can essentially earn tenure, which the idea behind tenure is that it's supposed to give you a little bit more freedom to answer big questions and things like that, and to do things like consult and to apply that work to those real world cases. And so I started consulting probably around 2015, 2016, and I've worked on several different cases throughout the state of Florida, usually. And I've talked with attorneys, so I've given like continuing education things and things like that, because one of the things that really drew me to this type of psychology, sorry, I'm in a hotel, so I'm actually at the APA conference, the American Psychological Association conference. So I'm a little out of sorts, but so one of the things that really drew me to applied psychology is the potential to make a real world difference with the research. And so it's not just that you're discovering new things or creating new knowledge and then having it go nowhere. It's that you can actually apply it to these real world cases to help ameliorate this injustice, right? And so I actually was when I started, I was like looking at becoming an attorney, and then I was looking at this, and the idea of being able to really use science to understand and answer questions was very appealing to me. And so that was one of my goals when I started my job, was to eventually start working on some real cases and trying to have a broader impact than just in publishing research. So I started by doing continuing education classes for attorneys in different parts of the state of Florida. And I made connections with the Innocence Project, which is a nonprofit organization that works on cases where people have claimed actual innocence. So cases where people have claimed that they were convicted and they didn't actually commit the crime. And so in these cases, a lot of times what happens is that the attorneys will get all the information from the trial. And so you're looking at trial transcripts, depositions, all the evidence, the case file from the police officers, and reviewing it to try to ascertain, okay, so did something go wrong here, right? And in the case that I worked on, I had made a relationship with the Innocence Project of Florida. One of my former PhD students actually just ended working there, but she worked there for about 9 years. And so we had a good relationship with them. I mean, we still do have a good relationship with them. She just moved on to a different thing. But they called me when they came across this case. So what happened in this particular case, across the state of Florida and across the United States, prosecutors' offices are forming these different conviction review units, and it's really up to the individual prosecutor office, so whether they're going to start doing this. But the idea is that they review cases, old cases, right, where someone was convicted and claims still actual innocence, and they look at the evidence, and they look at whether the evidence that was collected then would hold up today. And so this case came out of Broward County down in South Florida, for any of you from South Florida. And they found this case where the conviction was on the basis of a single eyewitness. So a single eyewitness had seen the crime and then testified at trial about the circumstances or about identifying this person, and then they were convicted. Now, this case took place in the 1980s, and a lot of the reforms for eyewitness identification and a lot of our understanding of eyewitness identification has really developed in the last 20, 25 years. And so it was before any of that research was published. Like the first probably big push for eyewitness reform was in the late 90s. So 1988, Janet Reno, the Attorney General at the time, had formed a committee of prosecutors, defense attorneys, police officers, and psychologists to come up with best practices in administering lineups. And that just wasn't happening back in the 1980s. And it's kind of funny because I've been a professor since 2005. And I used to tell students, like, if an eyewitness makes an identification, it's possible that they're wrong. And my students would go, no, like they'd be like, are you serious? Because we had this kind of like intuition that we would never identify someone if it didn't match our memory, right? But now I tell y'all that in my class and you're all like, I know, we saw it on Making a Murderer or what, like it's become more of the common like knowledge that eyewitnesses aren't always correct in the last 20 years since I've been here. And likewise, it's become more common knowledge in the legal system. And we realize that procedures that we used 30 years ago are not necessarily the best procedures. So like, for example, one of the things that's very important is when an eyewitness looks at a lineup, you have to tell them, now you're about to see the lineup, this person, the suspect may or may not be there. And if he's not there, it's okay to say he's not there. It's just as important to exonerate innocent people as to convict guilty people. And so the police will keep working on the case. You don't have to worry, because what we find is that it's like taking a test with none of the above being an option, but that it's not even printed on the page. So imagine if you were like taking a test for class and the answer was none of the above, but you had to choose between these 5 options that were there and you didn't even know it was an option to say none of the above, right? You would choose something wrong. And if the lineup's well created, then there's a 1 out of 5 chance that you would be picking an innocent person, right? And so something as simple as that can affect whether a person picks someone who is innocent from a lineup. And so in this case, the person who was helping kind of review these cases in the conviction integrity unit saw, well, this is from the 1980s. Maybe the procedures are bad. We don't know. We have to look. One eyewitness. And so then that's when they called me in to review everything. So then I read through the case. I read through all the depositions, the police reports, and all those sorts of things. And not surprisingly, there are a lot of things that were different procedurally than how they would have been if it was conducted now. And so I submitted that report. The Innocence Project submitted a report where they looked into the person's alibi. A lot of times a person's alibi is, not surprisingly, one of their friends or family, right? Because who do we spend the most time with? Our friends and family. And unfortunately, juries are less likely to believe when your significant other says, yeah, they were with me, than if a strange person that you've never seen before is like, yeah, I saw them. But the odds of them remembering you for this nondescript, weird situation, right, is almost none. And so in that sense, the case was overturned because the prosecutor's office looked at the evidence, looked at the circumstances of the eyewitness at identification, looked at how the person became a suspect in the first place, and then looked at the alibi and said, you know what, today this case we wouldn't have even prosecuted it. It wouldn't have happened. And so this person had spent how many ever years in prison, 34 years in prison, for this thing that likely never happened. I mean, and it was astonishing, really, looking at the evidence. So that's kind of how I got involved with that and really what happened in the case. So I see a couple of questions.
Yeah, I think Justin's hand was first and then Morgan.
Okay. Hi, I'm taking a race and racism class, and I wonder in with the Innocence Project, how often you find that race is or racism is a factor in convicting people wrongly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge factor, to be quite honest. When you look at, actually, I can, what I'll do, so Dr. Watson, I'll send you, there's a little kind of an infographic, if you will, from the Innocence Project on race and wrongful conviction. So I'll send that to you in an email and then you guys can look at it. But it's very disproportionate. So Black people are overrepresented in not only who is convicted, right? So, because if you look at the proportion of people who are in prison, we have a big overrepresentation of people who are Black. And so then when you start looking at people who are exonerated, that discrepancy gets even bigger, right? And so it suggests that there's a lot going on there as far as race is concerned. And then if you start looking at kind of all the individual reasons why people are wrongfully convicted, there almost always is something that intertangles with race as a variable. And so with eyewitnesses, for example, one of the things that we see is that well, two things. So the first thing is that so we have something called the cross-race effect, which is essentially when you witness a crime or when a person witnesses a crime, they're going to be less likely to be accurate in identifying someone who doesn't share their race or ethnicity compared to someone who does share their race or ethnicity. So my background, I'm white, and so I would be more accurate as a witness in identifying a white perpetrator than I would in identifying a Black perpetrator if I were extrapolating that data to a particular case. Now, the other thing that is a factor there that may actually be even a bigger factor is what we call base rates. So when you put a person in a lineup, a lot of times the reason that police are doing that is because they have a hunch that this person is the person. Like maybe it's this guy, he's been in trouble before, and what we're finding is there is also an effective race in that threshold of whether police officers are likely to even put someone in a lineup in the first place. And putting an innocent person in a lineup is makes them at risk for wrongful conviction, right? Because there may be a mistake in a person's memory, or there may be these other kind of social factors that affect whether they pick someone out. So we know that race factors into both how they get into the lineup and then also into the choices that people make from lineups. So yeah, I mean, I think that, and you'll see that across all the different reasons for wrongful conviction. So like you'll see different things in interrogations and confessions and things like that too, that suggest that race is a factor. So that's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Oh, of course. Morgan, did you want to ask next?
Sure. So I really I just want to say I'm very passionate about your work with the Innocence Project. I've always been really passionate about that. So I find that really interesting. And I also read one of your articles on plea bargaining and the influence of counsel, which I found really fascinating. So I was wondering, as a freshman, how would you best recommend to get involved with something like the LEAD lab? Because that's something I've been looking at a lot recently.
That's a great question. And that's one of the questions that the online person had too, right? So I just want to make sure I'm getting all the questions. So yeah, that's an awesome question. So on the LEAD Lab website, we have applications that people typically will submit at the end of any given semester for the following semester. And a lot of times students are like, well, I should wait until I have some more experience or more things. But you can apply as early as you want to. And a lot of times what depends or what varies is what we have going in the lab that particular semester. So right now, for example, we're doing a big project where we're reading cases or we're coding cases from the Innocence Project to look at factors in pleas. And so there's this database called the National Registry of Exonerations. And in this database, it codes it has references for all the different cases where people have been exonerated for whatever reason, right? And so what we're doing is we're looking at each of those cases and then coding for some of the different plea variables for the ones that were pled out. And so that needs a big research team. And so typically what we'll do is we'll bring on a lot of people. And so it really just kind of depends on what we have going on from semester to semester. And then it also really is a great idea to apply early and often, because part of your research experience at UF, it can be completing an honors thesis and all those sorts of things, but especially in criminology, and I'm not sure how it is in other disciplines, but in criminology, you have to have research experience before you complete the honors thesis. It's really upsetting when you have students coming to you in their senior year and being like, oh, I have above the 3.5 GPA. I want to do an honors thesis. And you're like, oh my gosh, you only have one semester. There's absolutely no way you could do it. And so typically we ask students to start the honors thesis process in their junior year. So we have students looking so if you're graduating spring of your senior year, then spring of your junior year, you should be talking to faculty and saying, hey, I want to do an honors thesis. I'm thinking about this type of project. Would you be willing to supervise me? How does this work? What is going on with the process here? And then that gives you almost an entire year to go through IRB, which is our research board, our ethics board that makes sure we're treating people fairly and that we're doing good work. Get to the point where you defend that thesis. And then so with my students, the ones who have done honor theses are the ones who started research with me pretty early in their careers. So I had someone who started in the first semester of her sophomore year, for example. And so she did research with me for her sophomore year. She was able to apply for an undergraduate grant to do research through our professional organization. Which was awesome because it gave her money to be able to go and do the things. So she actually interviewed exonerees, so people who were wrongfully convicted. And so then she was able to compensate them for their time while she was talking to them. It actually happened during COVID. So instead of going to interview them, we did it on Zoom. But it was a super cool project, and she wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that if she hadn't been involved early in research. And then UF also, I'm sure you all have talked about it, or you will talk about it at some time. They have the University Scholars Program, which is a fantastic program. I honestly have not seen a better program to support undergraduate students with research in different institutions. I feel we're so lucky to have that because, again, it gives you support so that you can do the research, but it only happens if you do it earlier. Right? Because you can't wait until senior year to apply for it, because then by then it's too late. So yeah, so I think early and often, a lot of times students think that they have to have some sort of like experience in order to, like, they have to have taken research methods or something like that. On my application, I ask if you've had research methods, but it's more because I'm just curious. And when we put up our research teams, or when we create our research teams, I try to get a mix of people who are just starting out in research, people who have more research experience, and then a graduate student to help make sure that we're kind of like having a little bit of a mentoring process going on here. People are passing down their knowledge and the how-tos of research. So like, I wouldn't want an entire team of just people who are starting out in research, but we have, you know, more senior folks in lab that can help with folks who are just starting. So it really, it's not meant to be an intimidating process. I wish we could take everybody who applied every single semester, but we just don't have that much space, but we try to take as absolutely many as we can for sure. So then I have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Anytime.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions have appeared in the chat. The first one is about whether there's been any case that made you question going into this particular field.
I mean, there's been a few. That's a good question. Has there been a case? Not really. I mean, I think whenever I work on like a case in the field, like with the Innocence Project or with a defense attorney or the police or things like that, I always just get more fascinated. It's really kind of like, it's kind of wild. So one of the things that's nice about working on particular cases is that you always get more research questions because there's always more out there to learn. And so you, like, with your head all in like the theory and the methods, you look at it and you're like, oh, I wonder if that happens. How does that happen? Does that happen all the time? What's going on here? And so then you get kind of just, it's kind of a circular thing where you just get more excited about research, and then you go do more research, and then you come back and apply it to more cases and stuff like that. The only thing I think that is tough about research as a career is that it literally never ends. So like my husband is a psychologist, or not a psychologist, good Lord. He's an optometrist. So he does, he sees people, does eye exams, things like that. And I sometimes get a little jealous that when he comes home at the end of the day, he has like a break because he's like done all his stuff. He's done all his charting. He's seen all his patients. And then he gets, but I'm always sitting there like, oh, I could be writing about that, or I could be doing this. And so you have to have really good boundaries with doing research as a career, because otherwise it can bleed into all parts of your life. And then, you know, and sometimes that's good. Sometimes I like just like holding up and writing for 3 days or working on data for days and days. I enjoy that, but I also you have to have like the ability to kind of shut it off at times too. And so that's been a little tough for me, especially as I've had kids and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I mean, the cases really, all they do is make me more excited and like passionate about trying to do what we're doing in the field. So then I see another question in there too. A student who conducted her project through Zoom, other opportunities virtually. So the question is, you mentioned the student who conducted her project through Zoom. Are there opportunities available virtually, or would most opportunities require one to be in person? We do have a few virtual opportunities. We've worked with students in UF Online before and students who can't come to campus. We had to be really adaptable during COVID because we have a lab in Turlington. It's not like a lab like you would traditionally think of, like with beakers and, you know, like things like that kind of equipment. It's more like a conference table and computers, but it's so that we can do in-person kind of collaborations and in-person data collection and things like that. So Morgan, for the plea one that you read, we did an in-person data collection with that. But we do have some students participate only virtually, and typically for like meetings and things like that, we'll just Zoom them in like how we're doing right now.
And Chin has a question.
Hi, I'm interested in furthering my study in social psychology.
Awesome.
Especially learning more about moral development. So your field definitely excites me. I've also taken a course in legal psychology before. So,
oh, awesome. Did you have Dr. Cato?
Yes.
Yeah, we went, so different times. I'm older than he is, but we graduated from the same graduate program.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is actually, have there been instances with what you've experienced where studies on morality was translated into policies?
That's a great question. Most of the things I would say in legal psych and in kind of this intersection that look at moral psychology, I mean, some of it looks at policymaking type things and support for different policies. So I read a study recently, for example, that looked at what people's acceptable ratios are or how damaging they thought different outcomes were in the legal system. So, for example, in the eyewitness arena, just because we've been talking about that, there are 4 possible outcomes, right? You can convict a guilty person, you can convict an innocent person, you can let an innocent person go, and you can let a guilty person go. And so 2 of those are correct, right? And then 2 of them are incorrect. So in the study, what they did is they had people rate how bad each of those outcomes were. And typically our legal, or how good or bad, right? Because obviously 2 of them are good. But typically our legal system is weighted toward what we call a due process model. And what that means is that we in the legal system believe that it is worse to convict an innocent person than to let a guilty person go. So that's commonly known as Blackstone's ratio. And he was a judge who came up with this idea and said that it was better that we let 10 guilty people go free than to let 1 innocent person suffer. And a lot of times when you're making policy decisions and putting in different kind of like policies or laws, you're targeting toward trying to strike the balance. In an ideal world, you would let all the innocent people go and get all the guilty people, right? But the way that it actually works is that sometimes when we apply rules, it changes that ratio. And so the study was looking at people's kind of like what they thought was an ideal ratio. And what they found is that judges were more kind of skewed toward the Blackstone's ratio, where it's better to let guilty people go than it is to convict innocent people. Whereas lay people like ourselves were more likely to say that they were equally bad to do both of those things. So it's just kind of interesting looking at how we would create policy and then how we would implement it. And then the other thing that people have looked at with moral stuff is more on the developmental psychology side, to look at like how juveniles consider what happens with their moral development and what happens with their sophistication levels that allows them to either consider or not fully consider the consequences of the things that they're doing. And that most recently, kind of the most recent juvenile stuff in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that it was no longer constitutional to sentence people to death for crimes that were committed as juveniles. And then later on, they said that it was not constitutional to sentence people to life in prison without the possibility of parole for crimes committed as juveniles. And a lot of that is because our reaction to the idea that they aren't sophisticated enough to really understand the consequences of their action, nor do they have the brain development that allows them to kind of have that, I shouldn't do this part of their brain going on as much. We don't feel that it's just then to sentence them to these life type sentences.
Yeah, I remember Dr. Kenhill mentioning this about about how they're pushing to limit that age to like 25, I think.
Yeah, so the brain keeps developing throughout the 20s, right? And so there's a lot of people who are advocating for that kind of consideration in sentencing. So yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
You are so welcome. But yeah, the social psych people for learning social psych stuff at UF, they're fantastic. I mean, obviously we do it in our lab too. But I work with a lot of students who are both psychology and criminology majors because they have that kind of like overlapping interest. Yeah. But yeah, Dr. Webster is great, Dr. Cahill, Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Ratliff, they're all fantastic for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, another question from the list we could go to from Emilio Luna. How does a legal expert, or as a legal expert, how does one manage to keep the interference of their own emotions or opinions from influencing their work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, I would say, it can be pretty difficult when you think about kind of the outcomes and the consequences and the people at the ends of these policies and decisions and things like that. It definitely can be really heavy subject matter. Actually, one of my students she got her master's and then she ended up leaving because it was just too heavy for her to think about all the time. But now it's kind of cool. She works for Universal and she's doing the exact same thing, but just applying it to roller coasters. And she's very happy. She's like, the subject matter is so happy. I'm talking about what makes people happy. So I'm very happy for her. But so yeah, that can be pretty tough to kind of read about these cases and read about all these things all the time. But for me, I think that because I'm generally like when I work on cases, clearly I don't typically like interview an eyewitness or talk with the witnesses at all. My job is to really educate the jury. And so I look at what was done with the investigation. If anyone, I would talk to the attorneys. But for the most part, I'm not really interacting with the people themselves. And sometimes that can be tough too, because that there are, there's people who are really hurt by whatever happened, or that there is some serious outcome, so that can be pretty tough. But at the end of the day, what I see my job as is trying to use what we know in research to increase the best outcome for everybody. And so to kind of come in with that overarching goal makes it so that I can kind of separate that a little bit more from my own emotions. And then with research, in particular, one of the things that we try really hard in social science and to do is be objective, right? And so you try to approach it from this point that, okay, I'm looking at something that's measurable. I'm looking at something that I can observe, that somebody else can look at it and observe as well. And so when you kind of approach it from more of that scientific standpoint, you try to take some of that emotion out of it. But yeah, I'm not going to lie, sometimes the subject matter can be really tough.
Okay, and another question from Ireland Marshall. Was there anything in your undergraduate experience that you feel like specifically put you on the path to the career and the kind of research you're doing now?
Sure. So to be quite honest, I loved my research methods classes, which a lot of times students put off research methods because they hear it's hard. And they hear that they hear that it's going to be one of the toughest ones. And so I'm going to save it for my senior year. But I would actually advocate to take it sooner, because what that does is it helps you understand research, which then helps you in your other classes. So like in psychology and law, for example, both the one you took with Dr. Cahill and my course as well, we talk about research nonstop. So we're constantly like talking about this finding did this, and this study they did this, and they found this. And so if you have that kind of basic know-how of research methods, it's going to help you in all your other classes. It's like understanding the language before you are asked to speak the language. And so research methods is honestly what did it for me as an undergraduate. My path was a little weird. I started out as a biology major because almost like lots of undergraduates, I was like, oh, I think I should be a doctor. Smart people are doctors. So therefore I'm going to be a doctor. And so I started out in biology and I was like, wow, I hate biology. No offense to any of the biology people here. I'm a social scientist, but one of the things that we did in my lab is we wrote a research paper. And so we learned all about the scientific method, and we, made hypotheses and had these observations and things. And I was like, this is awesome that you can like objectively study something and answer questions. This is great. Now, the subject matter I was not crazy about. We were studying the thigmotaxis behavior of rodents, which essentially is the tendency for rodents to hug the wall when they're in open spaces. And so that's what we were doing. But I wasn't crazy about that because biology was not my jam. That's not to insult anybody whose jam it is, because I absolutely understand being passionate about something. So at that time I was kind of like, wow, I guess I can't be a doctor if I don't really like these things. What am I going to do? So then I was a music major for like a semester and I decided I didn't want to do that. And then I was looking through the catalog and I was like, well, psychology, I really liked my psych class when I was in high school. I took AP psychology, like some of you may have. And I was like, well, and I really loved research, even though I didn't love studying the rodents. I really liked this idea of research. And so I'll take research methods. So it was literally the first psych class I took at my undergrad institution. And my professor in it was doing work in eyewitness identification. And so we had to write a research proposal for the class on just a study or something. And I was like, wow, that's amazing that because I was mind blown about this idea that, you could be wrong and think that for sure you saw this person be totally confident and then be totally wrong. So I started kind of looking through academic journals and things when I was trying to figure out what to write my proposal about. And it was just like page after page. I was like, this is fascinating. So then I was a sophomore and I started getting involved with the research process with my professor. I just was like, can I do this? Do you need help? Like, what can I do? Because I just didn't really have a lot of know-how. We didn't have a class like this when I was an undergrad. And so I didn't have a lot of know-how about how to get involved. And he fortunately was like, sure, absolutely. And so then I ended up getting involved with the research and I was just really hooked. So I would say the best thing that you can do is to really get some research experience. And then you'll figure out very quickly if it's for you or not, right? So when you get that research experience, you might get in there and be like me and be like, this is amazing. I want to answer all the questions. Or you might get in there and be like, wow, this is tedious, or this is heartbreaking, and it might not be for you. So really getting the experience is where is the best place to start. And then once you have the experience and once you know, like, if that's what you want to do, go for it. Like, there are so many opportunities, not only at UF, but in professional associations for undergraduate students. And so it's just the earlier you can get involved, the better. So.
And we want to be respectful of your time. Do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So from Cooper Devane Prue, what's been the biggest challenge in your professional academic career thus far, and how did you overcome it?
That's a great question. Let's see. I mean, I would say the biggest challenge is the biggest challenge I would say is navigating the things, like kind of navigating the balance between the different parts of my life and my job, because like I said, a lot of times the job has a tendency to bleed into your all parts of your life, which is a challenge, but it's also something that I find when I'm doing a good job at like drawing boundaries and being like, okay, this is time for this is time for this, that I am really productive and happy at work. And so I think that but it's a challenge, right? To kind of make sure that you're taking care of all the different parts of your life, because it really does have the tendency to bleed into other parts of your life. As far as at the university, one of the biggest challenges has been kind of navigating all the different changes that have happened at the university since I've been here. So like, for example, in 2008, there was a big change in our administration, and our department at the time merged with another department. And then most recently, with all the political stuff going on in the state of Florida, that's been pretty tough to just think about and be like, okay, so how does this affect my life? How does it affect my work, what I can teach, all those sorts of things. So that's been a bit tough to navigate. But I mean, the best way, I think, to overcome those types of challenges is to really keep your eye on the prize and what's important. And at the end of the day, I think one of the best jobs in the world, because I love teaching, I love students, and I love one of my favorite things is to see y'all's light bulbs go off. Like when you see stuff that you're excited about or you're passionate about, because I remember that feeling of being like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. And so getting to have those moments with you all is just like amazing. And then getting to really drive my own research program and answer the questions I'm really interested in. That's really important to me. And I get to do that too. And so that's kind of the best way to really help navigate some of those challenges of balance or of environment or things like that, is to really keep your eyes on what's important and how you get to do the things that you really love to do. So yeah, I think that's the way I do it.
Fantastic. I think a good note to end on. And yeah, if you want to email me the infographic you mentioned,
sure.
I can post it on the same Canvas page where I'll be sharing this video for the students to complete the assignment. But thank you so much for joining us. Fantastic.
Oh my gosh, of course. Thank you so much for having me. And if any of you have questions, I mean, they have my contact information, right? If you have questions about research or the department or the program or any of those types of things, I'm absolutely happy to talk further with you or answer any other questions or things that you have. So please get in touch if you feel so inclined.
Awesome. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you.
Of
Yeah, this has been great. Let me